May 2023. I am Vandana Hari, founder and CEO of Vanda Insights, and today's guest host. Crude is staying put on a roller coaster. In the past month alone, we have seen Brent oscillate between a high of $87 and a low of $72. Currently trading around $76.47. So macroeconomic data and the mood in the financial markets has been in the driver's seat for the oil complex, I would say almost since the start of this year. And the ride has been characterized by bouts of panicky, risk-off selling, alternating with a gradual steadying of sentiment that we see and very cautious, slow price recoveries in crude. So what lies ahead for the oil markets? To discuss this, and to delve into some key geopolitical developments that are likely to shape the future of the energy markets in the years to come, I am joined today by David Rundell. He is the former chief of mission at the American Embassy in Riyadh and author of the book Vision or Mirage, Saudi Arabia at the Crossroads. We have Laurie Haitayan. I hope I got that pronunciation right, Laurie, who's Middle East and North Africa Director at Natural Resource Governance Institute, and David Five, making his debut on this show today. David is a Chief Economist at Argus Media. So a warm welcome to all three of you. David Rundell, I'd like to start with you. You've co-authored a column in Newsweek recently titled "Time is Running Out for a Negotiated Settlement in Ukraine." You put forth some very compelling arguments and suggestions, which I personally am fully on board with. But as I was reading the column, I thought some of those, or probably all of those, may be viewed as a bit contrarian in the Western capitals. Now, China seems to have tried at brokering peace negotiations between Kiev and Moscow, but it's made no headway. And meanwhile, we have, offensive, counteroffensive, continuing to escalate between the two countries. Now, the question I have for you is not something that you have answered in the column, and probably is a difficult question, but I'd really appreciate it if you could have a go at it, which is what do you see as the end game in this, and where do you see a possible breakthrough or turning point coming from?
Okay. I put forth what I considered to be a proposal for a balanced solution which would meet the requirements of both parties, by both of them having to make some compromises in their maximum demands. And in particular, I think it's been clear from the outset that Russia was concerned about the neutrality of Ukraine and the expansion of NATO ever closer to Moscow, and that this was a provocation that many people in the West are unwilling to acknowledge. They find it quite understandable that the United States would object to Russian missiles in Cuba, but they can't really understand why Russia would object to American missiles, which is what they would effectively be in the Ukraine. So that's a point where the Russians really do need to have there needs to be some compromise there. And what I said in the article was that it should be something like neutrality, like we have had for Austria, where the Ukrainians could join the European community, but they wouldn't join NATO. So that's the sort of compromise that I outlined in the article. Realistically, I don't expect that there's going to be a negotiation until there is a decisive victor on the battlefield. I said in an earlier article that Ukraine has about as much chance of defeating Russia in a war as Mexico would of defeating the United States, which is to say not much. And that really doesn't matter how many tanks China, let's say, for example, decided to send Mexico. It wouldn't really matter whether China sent Mexico a few tanks or a few anti-aircraft missiles. China would not affect that. And the NATO is not going to determine the outcome of this war. So in my expectation is that the counteroffensive is not going to be decisive, and that in the end, the Russians will probably impose a rather harsh settlement on the Ukrainians, harsher than they could have gotten if they had decided to negotiate. So if that's I wrote this article in hope that someone would decide that it was time to negotiate. I don't see that happening. And I think that the war will be probably over by the end of the year. And it will be an imposed peace rather than a negotiated settlement.
So you mentioned it'll end probably as a result of Russia being victorious. Is that how you?
Yes, I think that's probably likely. I mean, it depends on how you define victorious, but I don't really see the Ukrainians are not going to march into Moscow. That's for sure.
Sure.
The alternative is that the United States goes to war with Russia. I mean, that if NATO decides that that this is so important that they're going to actually have a war with Russia, that could change the equation. But barring that, I believe that the Russians will win. I mean, you're talking. I put this in an earlier article. You're talking about a country that, when it started, had 45 million people against a country that had 145 million people. A country that had a GDP, and now the Ukrainian population, 10 million of them have left. So they're down to a country maybe and 5 million are living under Russian control already. So you're down to a country of 30 million versus a country of 145 million. I don't really see how that turns out in the favor of the Ukrainians. Likewise, the Ukrainian GDP, is, I don't know, a couple $100 billion a year, and the Russians is close to 2 billion or 2 trillion. So, so how is this? The Ukrainians have no military industrial complex. Everything they get comes from the West. At some point in time, as I said, the people in America are going to get tired of paying the pensions of retired Ukrainian civil servants. So how you figure the Ukrainians are going to win is beyond me.
And there are already signs of discontent, not just in the US amongst the population, but even in parts of Europe, as you've pointed out.
The US gets a very biased, view. I mean, if you watch the American media, they tell you that, the Russians are losing, that the Russian army is just incompetent and made up of convicts. It's not a very edifying report on the American media.
I'd encourage our viewers to go take a look at your column in Newsweek. Laurie, turning to you, I want to talk Turkey with you today, literally and metaphorically. So there are general elections slated in the country for the 14th of May. And one of the most important questions being asked is, could President Erdogan lose his 20-year grip on power? I'm not sure we'll have time to get into that debate in the show, but let's talk about what's happening in Iraq that is related to Turkey, and I suppose in some way also to the outcome of the elections. We've heard from guests on the show that at least one key issue that is still outstanding, amongst a few at least, that needs to be settled before about 500,000 barrels per day of northern Iraq crude exports begin flowing through Ceyhan again, is Ankara wanting to renegotiate a $1.5 billion settlement it has been ordered to pay to Baghdad for violating their oil pipeline agreement. Now, and I suppose that can only happen after the results of next week's elections. So how do you see this playing out and obviously Kurdistan is losing a lot of revenue every single day that it's unable to export its oil.
So definitely we wouldn't want to discuss like the outcome of or predict the results of the elections. They're soon, so we can just wait for the results and see who's going to win, if President Erdogan will be able to convince the people again for the need for his presence, or there will be the opposition will be able to really make it through and win. So definitely that's one part of the issue related to Iraq and Kurdistan. But I think the other, so it's the problem, like the Turkish renegotiating the settlement, etc., is one small part of this issue. The bigger issue is with Iraq itself, Baghdad and Kurdistan and Erbil. So this is something that is not new. This is something that is not a surprise that comes about this issue of Kurdistan selling oil or gas through Turkey or through any means to the world. This has been something that has been going since if you want, the new Iraq, and it will continue if the root causes are not solved. At the end of the day, I remember in 2010, I used to work in Iraq through our organization. We used to work with the parliamentarians there, with the government there, about the need to have a new, if you want, new oil and gas law. This is 2010. We're in 2023. They're talking about like the potential of passing a new updated oil and gas. It never happened. Oil and gas law. The constitutional provisions that are that have different interpretations still are the same. Kurdistan has its own understanding of the constitution and its right to exploit oil and gas. Baghdad has its own understanding of regions such as Kurdistan of using the oil and gas. So basically, there are root causes that are not being solved. They're only solving the problems that are coming out and like trying to solve it now. They're saying that, yeah, this is putting a lot of pressure. So on the Kurdistan and even on Baghdad. So I think it's more than technical. It's not an issue of who's going to open the account in Citibank, who's going to look at it, etc. It's more about like the reading of the constitution. If they're not going to have a proper reading, understanding, final reading, and oil and gas law, you will continue having this problem every couple of years. In 2019, we had the problem. Now in 2023, so it's a couple of. But I think the issue of Turkey is something that will come after the election. So again, we're going to see if Erdogan is going to be president again, or the new government, or there will be a new leadership, a new government, and then we'll have to wait to see like how they will solve these issues. Because President Erdogan, we know, we've tested him for 20 years. It's expected what he wants to do, but not for the new leadership if there comes. So we'll have to wait.
So you think, is there a possibility that these exports could remain shut in for even months, conceivably?
Look, I don't want to have any projections, just saying that if Turkey will stay at its position, that even if an agreement is reached between Baghdad and Erbil, but they want an agreement, and what kind of agreement? Is it only about like this, how to pay the 1.5 billion, or it is more about like longer term guarantees and who is going to give the longer term guarantees? So it depends on all of that. So I think it could happen soon. It could happen like after a month.
Yeah, but clearly, as you say, there will be ongoing uncertainty because of the very complicated relationship between Erbil and Baghdad. David, crude has been jolted twice in 2 months by fear and panic in the financial markets. In March, it was round one of the banking turmoil. And at the end of April, it was what I would call turmoil 2.0 with the collapse of the First Republic. And then last week, it looked like the jitters were being amplified by the Fed chair, Powell ruling out rate cuts this year, something the markets have been banking or even betting on. And of course, the US debt ceiling impasse. Do you think this sort of manic market behavior that we have seen, especially amplified over the past couple of months, is par for the course for the rest of this year?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. I think, it's certainly playing in to across the commodity complex. I mean, let's remember where we are. We're still coming out of the after effects of a pandemic 3 years ago, even although that's been declared officially over as a global phenomenon. we have the war rumbling on in Ukraine, and so there are still major question marks about commodity supply out of the world's biggest single commodity supplier, which is Russia. And I think it's testament to the economic and financial concerns that with all those supply side issues that are still rumbling away in the background, benchmark crudes are around about $75 a barrel. I think you've mentioned the debt ceiling. I think everyone hope that sanity prevails in Congress and they manage to avoid a US default, because that would really send the global economy into a tailspin were that to happen. So hopefully wise counsel will prevail over the next couple of weeks and avoid that. There's been a lot of talk about the US dollar, which has lost about 11% in value since its peak last autumn. A lot of people saying, well, the commodity complex may be supported by further weakening in the US dollar. But I think you hit on a crucial point there, which is, inflation is not yet dealt with. And in that environment, our working assumption for many months now is that the US Federal Reserve is most unlikely to begin, loosening monetary policy before the end of 2023. Now, of course, all bets are off if we fell into a steep recession. We're not forecasting on the basis that that's what happens, but our sort of oil demand model really is running on a view that the Atlantic Basin enters a fairly mild recession in the second half of 2023. It begins to recover in the early part of 2024. But, I think we've got significant economic headwinds that face the Atlantic Basin economies in particular.
Yeah, so on the Fed's pivot or no pivot, you are in company with at least Barclays and Goldman Sachs, it seems. As we have the third headline in today's digest, it seems Goldman Sachs is also advising clients not to bet on the extent of rate cuts that some in the market seem to be betting on. You alluded to demand, and that was going to be my next question to you, because one of the challenges for the oil market, of course, and those who are watching it, who are exposed to oil prices, not necessarily in the oil markets, just watching, but their jaws dropped at 10% up and down swings on a weekly basis, is how are the markets, or those who are selling off oil, for instance, in the panic sell-off mode, how are they connecting that, whatever is happening in the financial markets with the bank failures or the debt ceiling or the Fed comments with oil demand? So if you look at global oil demand growth forecasts, and just to look at, for instance, OPEC and IEA and EIA, we see the US EIA at the very conservative end, with 1.4 million barrel per day year-on-year growth, and we have OPEC at the other extreme end with 2.3 million barrels per day. I'd like to ask you what's your house view? Where do you sit with your projections on oil demand?
Okay, now Argus Media, Argus Consulting are the side of our business that makes projections for commodity fundamentals. We've got an oil demand growth number for this year of about 1.8 million barrels per day. And of that total, we've got about 700,000 barrels a day of growth out of China. So we're certainly on China. I think we're maybe at the conservative end of the spectrum. There are a lot of people talking about 1 million BD plus. From China. We think recovery in China, although it is ongoing, we think it's going to be a fairly bumpy ride. And as long as the real estate sector in China is struggling, that's 25% of China's GDP. It's very diesel intensive, it's very commodity intensive. And we think until we see a major uptick from the real estate sector and the construction sector, Chinese recovery may flatter to deceive a little bit.
Yeah, I actually wanted to come back to you a little bit more on China later. But David Rundle, demand is certainly one very crucial market metric that that OPEC Plus and within that Saudi Arabia must be keeping a very keen eye on. We had the IMF last week project that Saudi Arabia needs $80.90 per barrel to balance its budget. Of course, the break-even price is lower than the past 2 years, according to the IMF, but it's of course way above where crude is trading today. It also said the kingdom will run a budget deficit. In fact, the kingdom came out with its Q1 data. The GDP had decelerated to 3.9% in the first quarter, after compared with the stellar full-year expansion of 8.7% last year. A 770 million budget deficit as well in Q1 as government spending outpaced any increase in revenues. Do you see the fiscal and budgetary considerations impacting how the kingdom steers policy decisions within OPEC Plus?
Well, let me make comments before I try to answer your specific question. I was the economic counselor in the American Embassy in Riyadh for some time. With all due respect to the IMF, this break-even number is something that people like to put in the newspapers, and I find it almost meaningless.
Yeah.
In fact, break-even gives you a price, you any quantity, and your revenue is a factor of both price and quantity. So what are you talking about, really? It's a number that people like to read in the newspaper. The second thing is budget deficit based on what budget? I mean, there's a great deal of capital expenditure in the Saudi budget, which is discretionary, which they can turn on and turn off. And when they have a problem, they usually turn off capital spending, and they have certain salaries, for example, things they have to pay, they do pay that. But, there's a lot of capital expenditure that is discretionary. So I don't really put a lot of, in fact, I don't put any credit in that comment. The second question is about Saudi GDP, which if you look at Saudi GDP figures, they completely depend on the price of oil. They're all over the place. Yeah. I mean, there's no country in the world, the major country, certainly no G20 country, where GDP goes from 1% negative to 8% positive in the course of 2 years. I mean, it doesn't happen. So those are not very useful statistics when it comes to Saudi Arabia. The question you have is about the budget. You want to know about, is that what you want to know about?
No more so. Well, just it's keeping our audience in mind, because and I'm glad if very welcome if you want to bust some of these myths and especially the ones that are propagated more in media reports, because there is this sort of a received wisdom, if you will, in the markets that $80 is probably a floor that OPEC Plus, read as Saudi Arabia, would try and defend for crude. So, that's the sort of angle that
Well, that's a whole different question. I mean, that's a whole different question. I mean, and I think that's probably right. I think, the Saudis would like to get as much money as they can without driving the world into a recession and therefore destroying demand. That's been their policy all along, and that's still their policy. And I think right now they think that 75 or 80 is a reasonable number that they can hope for without destroying demand. So yeah, I don't disagree with that number. Okay. 75, 80, 70, somewhere in that range. But that's a different number than this break-even number. But I agree with that number. Yeah.
Okay. So you wouldn't conflate, you wouldn't advise anybody to conflate the two, that this is a budget break-even number, and hence that is the sort of level that they would try.
No, I think they would look. If they had a budget surplus, would you think they would say, we have a budget surplus, so gee, I guess let's make oil $40 a barrel because we have a surplus. We don't need the money anymore. No, I don't think they're going to do that. They're going to try and get as much as they can, and so would you.
Yeah. Fair enough. Laurie, I wonder if it's any coincidence that Turkey is finding a 1 billion barrel oil field just ahead of elections, which President Erdogan says can pump up to 100,000 barrels per day. Then they recently also started production from the offshore Sakarya gas field. Let's talk about the gas field first, because it gets also quite a bit of press as whatever potential new gas sources in the region that the EU, that the Europeans can get their hands on. My question to you is, given that Turkey itself needs and could use that gas, do you see Turkey actually wanting to export it to Europe? I mean, why wouldn't they just use whatever oil and gas they find, specifically gas, at home?
Yeah, or you think of it that Turkey uses the gas that it finds, and then that means that Turkey is going to buy less from the market, and that whatever it doesn't buy can be like in the market, okay, and whoever wants to buy it can buy it. And definitely, yeah, this is part of Mr. Erdogan's policy when it comes to energy, that independence that he had been talking about, and he had been very much like pushing for discoveries happening in the country. So indigenous discoveries. So the gas field that happened like a couple of years ago, not long ago, and that he really pushed for it to really for the first gas to come soon and not take long. Same for the discoveries that are happening on oil, on the oil side as well. He just wants to keep pushing that agenda of energy independence so that he could really ease the budget and makes less pressure on the budget, because 90% or more than 90% of Turkey's needs of energy is imported. So that's a lot of pressure on the budget. Definitely that is the trend. Now for the announcement, definitely we can read it under like this new discovery announced days before the election.
Convenient,
right? Of course, these are the tools that politicians use, especially during elections, because during elections, everything becomes crazy and everything becomes allowed, I guess. So, but definitely there is a trend in the policy of the Turkey. And I don't think that whatever leadership will come will change that policy. They do want to become as much as they can independent. It's not like one discovery here and one discovery here that will make them independent, but they are on the track of becoming as much as they can less dependent. And then I guess Turkey's aim is more like to become the transit hub. So, and play that role. And that was something that was really empowered by Russia as well, because politically it was convenient to push Turkey to their side. So then they said that, yeah, why not Turkey becoming the next hub for already, because there is Azeri gas coming through. There are many from many sources, like the Turkish gas is flowing through Turkey. So why not as well for Russia to boost its and increase its gas and through Turkey, which is something that Turkey would want to do.
Yeah, though going by trading hubs and just having watched attempts around the world for countries and cities to set up trading hubs, and I think that will be a much longer process than developing and I agree with you, the gas field was indeed developed in a remarkably short time, so maybe the same will happen to the oil field as well. Shall we have the survey question? So our question today is, the biggest driver of volatility in crude over the next 4 weeks will be the debt ceiling crisis in the US, the banking sector stresses in the US, or the OPEC plus policy meeting on June 4. And of course, there's always an option. All of them are going to drive volatility. I'd like you to pick which you think would be the biggest driver of volatility. And of course, that can be in any direction, up or down. And while we wait for the results, I'll go back to you, David Fife. You alluded to China, and I'd love for you to expand on that a little bit, because there's a great deal of interest, obviously, in the oil markets, because you look at what were the potential bullish factors when we started out this year, and one was big disruption in Russian supply, and the other was Chinese rebound. Increasingly, I don't see anybody using the word rebound in reference to China. We have that April data figures out today. Exports were up 8.5% year on year. which is a decent growth, I think, but not, not as decelerating clearly compared with nearly 15% growth that was seen in March. Commodity imports were down across the board, including crude oil, coal, copper. Crude imports averaged about 10.3 million barrels per day in April, which is down quite substantially from 12.3 million barrels per day in March. So what do you see in terms of, so you're talking earlier a little bit about your expectations for Chinese demand growth. What are your expectations in terms of their, do you see like a first half versus second half recovery? Do you see it accelerating much more in the second half of the year? And what are your expectations in terms of their crude appetite and fuel exports, if you look at that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think our view would be that you would expect, in the case of China, that was essentially shut down much of its economy for the best part of 3 years, you would expect much of the rebound to be pretty front-end loaded. We did get pretty strong 4.5% GDP growth in the first quarter in China. But as you note, commodity imports, they're better, they're stronger than they were last year. We saw an overall contraction in commodity imports last year. They're at least growing again on a year-to-year basis for the first 4 months of the year, but it's pretty anemic. And I think the concern for China is that a lot of the export markets for their manufacturing merchandise goods exports are in the process of slowing down. So, the manufacturing PMI data that came out the other day was pretty weak. Service sector PMIs were pretty strong. So we've got a number that's sort of 5%, finger in the air, 5% GDP growth, pretty close to target this year is our working assumption for China. But really, the idea that it's going to accelerate through the second half of the year is going to be pretty difficult to achieve overall. We did think the European diesel market was going to be struggling to find replacement supplies. One of the great hopes was that potentially China could help fill that gap. Not necessarily Chinese cargoes moving into Europe, but Chinese cargoes going into Southeast Asia and liberating maybe diesel supplies from east of Suez that could help fill the European gap. That may well still happen, particularly if domestic demand and particularly construction in China remains relatively weak. So yeah, there's the potential, I think, that refined products exports out of China remain relatively robust because domestic demand is lagging what they'd like to see.
Indeed, and diesel doesn't seem to be a problem at all from what I can tell as of now. Of course, we don't know what happens. I mean, globally and in the OECD countries, right? It's considerably under pressure.
Diesel cracks are back below $15 a barrel.
Yeah.
We expected them. Many other forecasts expected them to remain pretty robust in 2023 because of Europe's need to pull in imported supply long haul.
Yeah.
Now,
and gas substitution to some extent, I suppose, which also turns out isn't really needed right now.
Natural gas now also back below $10 a million BTU in Europe. So, so far the market is looking much more benign in terms of finished fuels, whether it's gas or diesel. But, let's wait and see what happens to Russian supply over the balance of the year. There is some talk about G7 trying to enforce the price caps a bit more rigorously than they have up to now. So there's a big question mark still over Russian crude and products exports to other destinations.
Indeed, we have a headline on that in our digest today as well. They're talking of cracking down on ships that are doing STS transfers or maybe turning off their sat-nav systems. Though personally, I feel, good luck trying to get an agreement across the EU on that one. But I think we've run out of time. We've had a wonderful discussion. We saw the survey results pop up there just a while ago. 27%, 27% each, more than 45%. Could we just bring up the results again, please? I think the majority were saying that the debt crisis, the banking crisis, sorry, will be the biggest factor of volatility, and then evenly split between the debt crisis, and our crisis is all over, and the OPEC policy meeting. Hopefully OPEC Plus doesn't create another crisis there. Well, with that, so we'll wrap it up here. Thank you so much to all my three guests, David Rundle, Laurie Haitayan, and David Five. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.